Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Road to Growth podcast. I'm lucky to have Eric Zimmer. You've been in the podcast game, almost 3 times as long as I've been in the podcast game. Since 2016, you run the podcast, the One You Feed podcast, right?
Yep.
All right. But besides that, you're also a coach. You've come over some strong struggles, something that I wasn't even aware about. You were kind of telling me beforehand of growing up and the things you've had to kind of get through. And let you tell your story. So can you please tell me who you are? Sorry about that.
Well, yeah, I am, as you said, I'm the host of the One You Feed podcast. I'm also a behavioral coach and a spiritual director. I do spiritual teaching. I lead people through spiritual programs, as well as behavioral coaching, goal-oriented coaching. I host the podcast. We've been around, I think 6.5 years, 350 episodes, maybe. A lot of episodes. So that's kind of who I am now. Over the course of my career, I've been a variety of different things, from homeless heroin addict to software entrepreneur, to working software projects in really large corporations, to owning a solar energy company. So I've done a whole bunch of different things, but that's sort of the high overview.
Well, yeah, I mean, walk us through coming from that. What got you on the streets? Where'd you grow up? What happened there?
Yeah. Well, what got me on the streets was me. I certainly had advantages. It's not like I grew up on the streets. I grew up in a upper middle class, or middle class to upper middle class home. And like most kids, I started to experiment with drugs and alcohol. And once I started, I just found that for whatever reasons, I reacted differently to people. And so I started drinking, and then I started doing other drugs. And by the time I was 24, I was a heroin addict, and I was essentially homeless. I had been kicked out of both my parents' house, kicked out of all my friends' houses, and I was living in a van that I worked in a restaurant, and they owned a van, and I was able to sleep in the back of the van. They didn't know I was sleeping in it, but that's where I was sleeping until I was arrested for grand theft, forgery, a bunch of other things. And at that point decided, well, maybe I better get things back together. So I went into treatment. It wasn't the first time I had been in treatment, but it was the time that I went, and it worked. And then I got into 12-step programs after that, and got sober, and I stayed sober about 8 years from there. Then I drank again for a few years. And even though I didn't burn the house down in the same way, I ended up it was a problem, and I had to get sober from that. And I think I've been sober now completely for 14 and a half years.
So, I mean, I talked to a lot of people here that go through their struggles. I talk to people side here that go through their struggles too. And some struggles might seem bigger than them compared to other people's ideas. When you're talking about that, you were basically a functional heroin addict, right? And because you're still working still, right?
Well, I was working, but I would not consider me functional. I was working because it was the only way I had to get money to feed my habit. And I was also working, and it allowed me to steal money and lots of different things. I would not consider me functional. No.
Okay, so that was your driving force. That was kind of your driving force of working to get your next fix.
It was everything. Yeah.
From what I understand is when you go into rehab centers, that can be very difficult getting off a drug. So it's also, you got to find your big why of what's pushing you to be sober, right?
Yeah.
So what was that driving force for you?
Well, I think my big force at that point, the big why, was just that my life really sucked the way it was. I mean, I finally hit the point where it was very clear to me that all I did was hustle around and work incredibly hard and commit crimes and do all this awful stuff just in order to take a drug that didn't even make me feel that good anymore. So, I think that the two things get us. I often reflect on sobriety, and people talk a lot about hitting a bottom, and I
Yeah.
certainly hit a bottom, right? I mean, I had been arrested, and I was looking at going to jail for 40 or 50 years if I didn't turn my life around. So that was a pretty big motivating
Yeah.
why. So hitting a bottom was really important, but then also there has to be, I think, hope. And so being in rehab gave me hope. I started to see other people who had gotten sober, and I looked at their lives, and their lives looked way better than mine, and they were saying that they used to be like me. So I had that hope that, like, oh, okay, well, maybe I can be like that. So I think my why was just to live something that resembled a normal life, that wasn't just driven by this insatiable craving for more drugs that never goes away, and that, became more important to me than anything, more important than my family, more important than my friends, more important than music, which had been my passion. It became the driving force of everything I did.
When do you think, because I know a lot of people that go away from pain instead of go towards pleasure. When do you think you were able to change that mindset of actually building something towards pleasure?
That's a really good question, and I don't know if I could point to. I think they happen a little simultaneously, right? On one hand, I'm moving away from pain, and on the other hand, I'm starting to feel better.
Yeah.
You know, I'm starting to be like, "Oh, look, this is a nice way to live. This is a better way to live. Oh, look, I'm making friends. Oh, look, I feel good about myself, right? I don't feel like a monster all the time. I don't feel out of control all the time." So I think they happen in parallel to a certain extent. But at a certain point, for most people, if they get sober and stay sober, at a certain point, the desire to use kind of goes away. And then at that point, it's very much about moving forward. It's very much about, okay, like, well, what is life about now?
So it's many wins on many wins until you can get that big win. And I think that's probably for a lot of business owners too, right? I mean, I know it's some
Totally.
kind of similar correlation. So getting back to your game plan of building a business. So you're sober now.
Hmm.
How are you making money? What's that looking like?
Yeah, well, when I got sober, all I had done up to that point was work in restaurants and steal things. That was my life. That was my resume. But I stumbled into an internet company in Columbus, Ohio in 1994, several years before the internet hit, called CompuServe. And they were one of the first online companies that existed. And that was very fortunate for me. I got a job in customer service, and I just worked really hard. I suddenly was like, whoa, wait a second. I see some sort of path here. I had no hope for so long, and I saw some sort of path. So I started working hard, and then I got promoted. And then I left that job. I got laid off. They were bought by somebody else. And before long, I found myself in this small software startup company in Columbus, Ohio, in roles that I had no business having. And it was kind of amazing because the company got $150 million in venture capital money in Columbus, Ohio in like 1998, which was, I mean, I don't know if any company in Columbus, Ohio has still ever gotten that kind of money to this day. Um, and I was on the ground floor of that. Now that company ultimately went bust, but it was just this incredible experience for me of like building a company, and the excitement of that, and the fun of that, and the joy of it. And like I said, I was in these roles that I had no training for. I'd never been to college. I got kind of lucky in a lot of ways, right? I worked really hard, but I also got really lucky. And so that kind of launched me into a career in the software business. So when that company failed, well, I got out before it failed, but when it looked like it was going to, I found a job with another small software startup company, and then I worked for another one after that. So I kind of went from these software startup companies, and I would come in when there might be 3 or 4 or 5 people there, and I was good at I've always been kind of a generalist. I've always been good at doing. Um, Give me almost anything, and I can do it pretty well.
Yeah.
Not great, but pretty well. So I'd come into a company and it would be like, oh, we need somebody to lead our projects. So I would do that. And then we need to build a customer service team. So I would do that. Oh, wait, we have sales trouble. So I would go and work in sales. Oh, we need help, building a software development team. So I was able to figure things out. But then after a certain point, once a company got to a certain size, you could hire somebody who was always better than me at any one of those particular things, So, once the company got to be a certain size and they're like, all right, we've got a customer service department, you could hire somebody who knew what they were doing. So, I did that cycle for a number of years. And then I started doing some consulting work for very large software development projects for corporations. And I started a solar energy company in there.
Well, so before we get into the solar energy part of it,
Mm-hmm.
what do you think you took away from startups, like the positives, the negatives of a startup company?
The positives, I think, are that you can do a lot. At least for me, I could do a lot of different things. I got a lot of broad experience. That you don't get in a large company. In a large company, people are a lot more specialized. You've got your little area and you sort of stay in that area. In a small startup company, you're kind of all over the place, right? You're working very closely with the CEO. You're working very closely with executive leadership, but you're also working very closely with customers. I got lots of different experience, and I got experience doing things that in a large corporation, they'd be like, this guy does not have the qualifications to do this job. So I think that was, and it's fast paced, it's exciting. Every day really matters. So those are some of the positives.
Well, I mean, not necessarily joining a small startup company, but meaning that you started out with multiple different startups. One of them failed. I'm guessing the other two succeeded. You could probably see in each of their systems or what they did good and what they did bad, the positives and negatives of each startup. Maybe because maybe someone listening right now is thinking about building a startup, and they can kind of get the feel that you got
for like what makes a software success, a startup successful versus one that's not. Oh boy, there's so many factors that go into it. I would say if I boiled down, I could boil down several of the lessons. The first one was, and a lot of startups can attest to this, venture capital money is a blessing and a curse. We all think, I want money, I need money, but that comes with certain problems. In our case, the VC came in and said, you guys aren't thinking big enough. You need to build this 5 times bigger than you're planning. Well, we went and built it 5 times bigger, but we didn't have 5 times the customers. We had customers about like what we thought. And now we had 5x the infrastructure, which was unsupportable, and the company just crumbled under it. But that's the venture capital model largely. Venture capitalists want big hits, big successes, So the lesson I would take from that company was, well, okay, getting money is good and bad. Another company, I would say what our biggest problem was that we were selling too far ahead of our ability to deliver. Now, I think you always do this in a startup company. You're always sort of saying, well, we can do this thing, and your development of your product's lagging behind that a little bit, right? That's just the way it works. But you have to be able to jump that gap when the time comes. You have to be able to, if somebody goes, okay, I want that thing, you got to be able to figure it out really quickly. I think we got too far ahead in one of the companies. We were out there saying, we can do this, we can do this, we could do this. And we sold it really well. When it came time for the product to do that, we couldn't get it there fast enough. And so we had a lot of disillusionment among really big, important customers. If I had to say if there was any one main thing, that was the case. We got that ratio wrong. The other company went on and succeeded. The other company was much slower, much steadier. We took on venture money, but not a ton of it. And the founders were just a little bit more consistent, slow and steady. And we did a good job in that organization of balancing. In every startup, you sort of you're having to adjust what you do based on what the market's telling you, right? And this company just found the way to sort of keep the existing business it had and do that, but also branch into new areas at a rate that worked. And then some of it is honestly just luck. Some of it is just luck. When did you start? What are the market conditions like? What, my solar energy company, I failed largely. It was not that I didn't do things wrong, because of course I did, but the biggest factor was just timing. The timing was wrong. Had I been 6 months earlier, it would have been a different story. Had I been 3 years later, it would have been a different story, but I landed right in the wrong window.
Do you think there's anything you could have done from all the knowledge you've accumulated and learned now that could have made it the right window?
Yeah, well, maybe. I don't know in that situation. What I did with the solar energy company was I decided I was going to go into an industry that I knew nothing about, which just was not wise. In retrospect, I underestimated how long it was going to take us to get to market with what we had. I thought I would get there faster. But I didn't know the business well enough. I didn't know the complications. I didn't know the ins and outs of it. Energy is a pretty highly regulated business. There's a lot that goes on in it. There's a lot of vested interest in the existing utility companies. So there were a lot of things I just didn't know that, if I'd known them, if we'd known them, I might have been able to get there faster. But I think my core mistake was assuming that I could enter an industry that I knew nothing about that quickly. I should have either said, I don't know enough about this, I'm not going to do that. Or I could have found, if I'd done a better job of finding partners early. I also didn't make great decisions personnel wise in certain cases. I could have acted more decisively with certain personnel and maybe moved on more quickly that would have allowed me to get where we were going faster. So I made some decisions in that case. There's that old saying, hire slowly, fire quickly. I didn't do that. I hired really quickly and did not get rid of people quickly if they weren't the right fit. We were small. It was a small, very personal sort of company. And I didn't want to hurt people's feelings.
Yeah, it's tough. So how long did your company last for? Your solar panel company?
About 5 years.
Okay. And when did you know that it was time to shut the doors?
Well, what happened was solar energy, still to this day, but particularly then the company ended 6 years ago or so, particularly then, even more so, was very dependent upon particular government subsidy to make solar energy work, right? It was a developing industry. And so when I started the company, there was a set of laws in Ohio that governed how it was going to work. Well, what happened is that the legislature started changing those laws. And so the first time that it happened, we had about $10 million in signed contracts that went up in smoke because our investors saw what was happening with the laws in Ohio and pulled out. And so I was like, okay, that feels like I just got kicked in the you-know-whats, but okay, we'll bounce back. And so we did, and we got back and then it happened again. And it was like another $15 million in contracts went away. And after that, I just said, I can't do this anymore. Like, I can't have something so out of my control as the legislature like that I just can't do anything about and yet be so dependent on it. And I was ending up spending a lot of time doing things like being part of industry groups and testifying in Senate hearings and lobbying and doing all this stuff that we needed, but also wasn't directly giving me revenue. So after the second time, I just lost my heart for it. I just kind of had a broken heart. I don't want to do this again. So, that's when I shut it down. And Ohio to this day has just not been what it could have been solar wise. Now that's not to say solar energy companies in Ohio haven't succeeded, because some have, but they were trying to do something very different than we were. We were aiming, we had bigger bigger aims, and those aims just have not come to fruition in Ohio at this point, just for anybody really, just due to the state of the laws here in Ohio.
So after you leave the solar panel company, you close the doors in there. What happens next?
I'm working as a consultant in the software business for a large Fortune 100 company on some software product management, and I'm kind of just ruminating on what I want to do next. And that's when the idea for the podcast came about. And I just did it. I mean, I didn't really do it thinking I was starting a legitimate business so much as I thought, it would be fun to interview people about what it means to live a good life. I'm reading these sort of spiritual self-help, personal development books anyway. It might be good to interview people about them. It would be fun. It would be good for my mind state. The solar energy company had failed. I was in a really bad marriage. I was just not in a great place. And so I thought, it would be good for me to read all these books and interview these people. My best friend was an audio engineer, and I was like, it would give, he could do all the audio for it, and we could spend more time together. And so I just sort of did it as a fun / something that I felt like would be just good for me. It would keep my head in the right place. And then we started it, and it went fairly well. I mean, Apple, in our first year, Apple named us as one of the best podcasts of 2014, which was luck. I mean, it was luck that Apple, when I say it was luck, I mean that, yes, you have to have a good podcast to do that, but there were lots of good podcasts. We just happened to get noticed by Apple. I don't know why, but they liked it. And so that gave us kind of a nice boost. That sort of got us over the hump, at least as far as getting into the thousands of listeners, per week kind of game, instead of the 100 or and so then it was just sort of slow and steady growth for us. And, so yeah, that's kind of why I started, and that's kind of what happened after the solar energy company. And after a certain amount of time of doing the podcast, I started to think, maybe there is a business here. Maybe there is. I loved it. I knew I loved it. I knew I loved the work I was doing. And so over time, I started to think, well, maybe there's something here that I could do. But all that time, I was still working in the software business.
How did you figure out, or who gave you the idea to figure out how to monetize your podcast to make it actually a sustainable career?
I just read things online. I listened to podcasts. I read things online. It became clear to me pretty quickly that if you were going to monetize a podcast, you were going to do it in one of a couple ways, right? You were either going to have ads, you were going to have donations, or you were going to use the podcast as a means to sell something else. Those are the three primary ways. And so, and two of those sort of just landed on our door. We started to get brands saying, do you take sponsors? And they happened to be really well aligned with what we did. And so I said, sure, we do. And so our first ad revenue sort of came to us. It was brands that were very well aligned, like publishers of the type of books authors that we interviewed, or magazines that were in a similar niche. And then I started to have listeners ask me, did I ever do one-on-one work with people? And I originally said, no, I don't really do that. And then at one point I thought, well, why not give it a try? And so I said, I'm going to start offering a little bit of coaching. And once I did it, even like 2 times, I went, oh, wait a second. I know how to do this, because in 12-step programs, we have something called sponsors. You have a sponsor, and a sponsor is essentially a life coach. It's like a sobriety life coach. And I was like, I've done this, probably for 100 people over the last 15 years. So I've done this a ton. I wasn't getting paid for it, but I've done it. So I immediately went, oh, I know how to coach. I think I'm pretty good at it. I like it. And so now we had these two ways of making money. We had some podcast sponsorship. We had a little bit of coaching. And so then it became about, okay, how do I develop those to the point that they can support me? And I was, at that point in my career, I was a pretty well-paid software consultant. I was making a pretty fair amount of money, and I had a mortgage, and I had kids. I had kids going off to college soon. I wasn't really in a position to be like, well, you know what? I'm going to throw it all in and go after the podcast. And if I make, $25,000 a year, that's fine. Right. Like I had a pretty big number I needed to be able to hit. So it really took, it was about 4.5 years of from the beginning of the podcast until I was able to make the break and go, okay, I think I can make this work, And so when I did that, I had enough money saved up that I knew like, okay, I can pay, X number of months. It was an educated risk. It was still a risk because I walked away from, a pretty fair amount of money. But I had a path in my mind that I could see that didn't seem unreasonable to getting back to something close to that. And it's been 2.5 years and it's still going, and we're doing pretty well. I mean, I'm not rich, but I'm about where I was, in a pretty well-paid software career, and I'm doing something I love full time. And so it's gone well.
Is there anything that you've learned in the last couple of years that would have expedited the process of getting you to where you are now?
I'm not really sure. I don't know. I think that sometimes things just take time. Sometime like our podcast growth has just been like this. It's just slow and steady. And I haven't been able to figure out how to ramp that hockey stick up. Right now, I do know, like, okay, we've gotten better at marketing, and that's, we've been able to be a little bit more sophisticated in what we do. And, so there's these tactics that we can implement, but I don't know that any of them would have dramatically accelerated the natural curve of increasing listeners. The more listeners we got, the more ad revenue we got. The more listeners we got, the more coaching clients we could get. It was all driven off of that sort of increasing. Now we've gotten better at selling. We've gotten, one thing that we did do that might have accelerated us a little bit was we joined a podcast network that started taking over selling our ads for us. And although we gave them 30%, we give them 30%, it's been a deal that's been every bit worth making because they have been really good at selling. They've been really consistent because they've got salespeople who they sell them, or, that's their living. And for me, I was more sporadic, okay, maybe I'm selling more this month, but I'm not doing as much next month, and then there was something to knowing that, okay, it's time to make the jump, because I just knew that I was sort of maxed out doing a very demanding full-time job and trying to do the podcast and the coaching and all that I knew there was a point where I just needed more time. And the only way I was going to get that was to get out of the job. So I had to make the leap. And that leap did accelerate our revenue a fair amount because I suddenly had more time.
Well, okay, so everything goes in cycles, right? So you've already brought the idea of how the startups, as you get bigger and bigger, you start leveraging and start bringing on different people. So you have that in basically the paid ads you're getting. Is there another avenue that you look at leveraging out in the future?
Yeah, I think where we are as a business right now is I do a lot of one-on-one coaching work, and I am maxed out on that. So I am at a place where I can't scale the business any further because I just don't have more hours of me. So what we have to figure out is we have to start to have product offerings that we can offer to people that don't involve me delivering them one-to-one. So we've got to find a way to scale. And I knew we would get in this spot because when I left, I knew I was going to need to do X amount of coaching in order to make a living. And I've got somebody who does a lot of marketing work for us. I've got an assistant. There's people who are getting paid in all this also beyond just me. And so I knew I was going to need to do a certain amount of one-on-one coaching. And I knew what was going to happen was that was going to make me very busy. but I thought it's worth it to get out of the full-time job, which it was. But I'm hemmed in that I need to do a X amount of work every week in order to make our revenue numbers by coaching. But I also need more time to develop the next program. So we're sort of in that. We're in that. It's a little bit of a challenge, and we're finding our way through it. We ran a group program. We ran a group program earlier this year that did really well for us. And, I was able to work directly with 60 people right at a time instead of one at a time, for a very different price point, obviously, per person. So that went well. So we'll run that again. And we're just working on what those next programs are. So that's the next area of growth for us, is to begin to create programs that people can consume, that they get value from, that don't involve me in an hour to hour basis, so that I sort of scale. So that's the next challenge for the business.
And I think that's always the dance, right? Where you're trying to find, okay, well, you need the now business, but you also want to find a way to leverage your time and build something better in the future. So where do you allocate your time? So that's definitely a balance.
Yeah. Yes, every small organization has some degree of that. As I did consulting in the software business for years, I had the same problem. It was like, okay, I just sold a great deal, so wonderful. Now I've got to go deliver it. But while I'm delivering it, I got to figure out how to sell the next one.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm delivering full time and more. And so it's always that dance. People talk about it. I don't know who coined this phrase, but it's a really useful idea, is like, there's working in your business and there's working on your business, right? And you've got to be able to find some time to work on your business. If you're just always in it, you stagnate, right? And that's the way particularly individuals, whether you're a small 1 or 2 person organization, it's a problem that most people find. And so, for us, it's just been about carving out a certain amount of time. It's not as much as we would like, but a certain amount of time, and just consistently working on the other thing. So most of my time is going here, but I've got a little bit that's going to the new thing, just consistently. One of my favorite phrases, I use it in the behavioral coaching I do, I use it in a lot of places, is that little by little, a little becomes a lot. And that's the way it's got to be for a lot of it's, little by little, a little becomes a lot. It was the way we built the podcast business. It was just every week, each week, a new episode, put out a good episode, week after week. We've had an episode out every week for, I don't know, 6.5 years. We haven't missed a week. It's just been that steady boom, 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 one after the other. And slowly it builds, and so that's, yeah.
I still agree. I mean, with all the knowledge and everything you have accumulated over the years, what kind of advice, if you could talk to your younger self, that person, that 24-year-old, that was in kind of a bad place, what kind of advice would you give them?
Well, I think the 24-year-old finally figured it out and did a good job. I think the advice I would give my younger self in general, if I had to just give him one piece of advice, it would be to relax and enjoy it all a little bit. Like, just take it easy. It's going to be okay. It's going to work out. It's going to, just relax a little and enjoy the ride a little bit more. If I could only give one piece of overall advice, if I was going to give one piece of business advice, it might be the one I just gave, which is just find your thing that you want to do and do it a little bit. When I was younger, I got really caught up in the dichotomy that I think a lot of people find themselves in. And it was this idea that either I worked a full-time job for somebody else and I let my dreams kind of die, or I took some giant plunge off the deep end and tried to build my own thing, which felt terrifying and reckless. And I think a lot of people, those are the two options they see. And what I wish I had seen more, that I had seen earlier, was you can keep doing the job you've got to do, but you've got time. There is time. If you use that time well, you could start building your thing on the side, and little by little, a little will become a lot. And I could have done that. I could have started doing that when I was younger. You know, I didn't really start that. I started that with the solar energy company when I was, I don't know, how old was I when I did that? So I was 38, maybe a little older, right? So I didn't finally launch my own thing until I was, you know, much older. And so I wish that when I had more of that youthful energy, I had just done a little bit at a time, little by little. And I would tell my younger self, invest in your 401k, for crying out loud. I know it's what everybody says, but it's the right thing to do. Do it. Because that follows the same principle. Little by little, a little becomes a lot.
Exponential growth right there.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Eric, for being on the podcast. I mean, I appreciate you being on here. If someone's looking to find your podcast, some of your coaching, what are some of the best platforms for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, the best thing is just to go to our website, which is oneyoufeed.net. It's all spelled out, ONEYOUFEED.net. And we're also on, you know, all the popular social platforms, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. Search for the One You Feed, you'll find us.
And in the comments, I mean, in the description, we'll have all the links there too. So if anyone's listening right now on YouTube or listening on Apple, Google Play, any of those kind of platforms, you'll see in the description. And yeah, thank you again, Eric, for being on the platform. And hopefully everyone listening got some great nuggets right there. It doesn't matter where you start. It matters where you end, and enjoy the journey.
That's right. And just start. Just start.
Yeah. So thank you again, Eric.